I bought my off-grid cabin 2 years ago specifically because I wanted to disappear from connectivity for stretches at a time. No power lines, no cell towers close enough to matter. A solar setup with battery storage, and a backup propane generator for the days when the panels couldn't keep up. I'd done my research. I knew exactly how that system worked. Every wire, every switch, because I'd installed most of it myself with a contractor friend over a single exhausting summer. That detail matters for what happened. The cabin sits at the end of a logging road in northern Idaho, about 50 minutes from the nearest town if the weather cooperates. I use it as a writing retreat a few times a year, usually alone, usually for a week or two at a stretch. I'd stayed there probably a dozen times without anything unusual happening. I knew the place. I knew its sounds, its quirks, the specific way the wind moved through the gap between the cabin and the woodshed. This particular trip was in late October, my first visit after summer. I arrived in the afternoon, did my usual walkthrough, checked the battery levels, confirmed the generator was full and ready as backup, and settled in for what I expected to be an ordinary week of writing in silence. The first night, I woke up at exactly 3:14 inches the morning to the sound of the generator running. I want to be precise about why this confused me immediately rather than gradually. My battery bank was at 80% when I'd gone to bed. There was no reason for the automatic transfer switch to kick the generator on. It only does that when the battery drops below a set threshold, and 80% was nowhere close to that line. I lay there in the dark, listening to the engine cycle outside, trying to come up with an explanation that made sense. I got up, checked the control panel by flashlight, and found the battery reading at 81%. The generator was running for no reason the system should have recognized. I shut it off manually, checked the wiring as best I could in the dark, found nothing obviously wrong, and went back to bed telling myself it was some kind of sensor glitch I deal with properly in daylight. The second night, it started again at 3:14 exactly. Not approximately. Not somewhere around that time. The display on my phone read 3:14 when I bolted upright at the sound of the engine. I'd noted the time the night before specifically because the precision of it had unsettled me, and now here it was again, to the exact minute. I went out of my boots and jacket this time, flashlight in hand, and stood next to the generator while it ran, watching the fuel gauge, the oil pressure light, every indicator I knew how to read. Nothing was malfunctioning that I could identify. The machine was simply running, switched on by a system that had no programmed reason to do so, at the exact same minute as the night before. I shut it down again. I did not sleep much after that. In daylight, I went over every inch of the wiring between the battery bank and the transfer switch. I am not an electrician, but I understand the system well enough to spot an obvious fault, and I found nothing. No corrosion, no loose connections, no reason for what I'd watched happen twice now. The third night, I decided to stay awake and watch the panel directly instead of waiting to be woken by the sound. At 3:09, I watched the battery percentage on the display begin dropping. Not gradually the way it does from actual draw. It dropped in clean, even increments, 10% at a time, far faster than any load in that cabin could account for, faster than even running every appliance I owned simultaneously could explain. By 3:13, it read 30%, low enough to genuinely trigger the transfer switch. And at 3:14, the generator kicked on exactly as it had the 2 nights before. I sat there staring at that display, trying to understand how a battery bank could lose 50% of its charge in 5 minutes with every single device in the cabin powered down, and I could not construct an answer that made any sense within how the system actually worked. What I noticed next is the part I have never been able to explain to anyone in a way that didn't make them think I was losing my grip on reality. The battery percentage, after the generator switched on and began recharging it, did not climb back up gradually the way it normally would. It jumped straight back to 81% within about 90 seconds of the generator engaging. The exact same number it had read both previous mornings when I checked it. I turned off every breaker in that cabin that night and sat in the dark with a headlamp and my truck keys in my pocket. The generator did not run again. The numbers on the display, when I checked them by flashlight every hour, did not move once. I left the following morning and called my contractor friend from town, describing exactly what I'd watched happen. He came out with me 2 days later, and we went through that entire system together, testing every component with proper equipment instead of my flashlight and guesswork. He found nothing wrong. Every component tested within normal range. He told me, somewhat uncomfortably, that there was no electrical explanation he could offer for a battery bank losing and regaining 50% charge in under 2 minutes with no load attached, and that whatever I'd seen wasn't something his diagnostic tools were built to find. I still use that cabin. I go less often now, and I never sleep in it without every breaker switched off after dark. The generator has never run on its own again. I check the display every single night before I go to sleep anyway, every hour if I happen to wake up, just to make sure the numbers haven't started moving toward 314 again. I don't know what made that battery drop and recover the way it did. I don't know if it will happen again. I just know I check every night without fail, and I don't think I'll ever stop. I'd been living off-grid in a cabin in the mountains of western Montana for almost a year when this happened. And I want to be upfront that I am not a particularly social person, which is part of why this story took me as long as it did to fully understand. The cabin came with the land when I bought the property, a 40-acre parcel with a single neighbor about 3 miles down the access road. An older man named Walt, who I'd met exactly twice since moving in. Both times had been brief, polite, the kind of conversation you have with someone you'll probably see again eventually, but don't feel any urgency about getting to know. He seemed normal enough, kept to himself, mostly. Same as me. About 10 months into living there, my truck broke down on the access road, about halfway between our two properties. No cell signal out there, obviously, which is part of the appeal of living off-grid and also part of the problem when something actually goes wrong. I decided to walk to Walt's place, since it was closer than walking all the way back to mine, hoping he had a working radio, or at least could help me figure out the truck. I knocked on his door, and when he opened it, his expression confused me immediately. He looked at me the way you look at a stranger standing on your porch, not the way you look at someone you've spoken with twice before. I introduced myself, mentioned that I owned the property up the road, mentioned both prior times we talked. He stood there for a long moment before saying, carefully, that he had never met me before in his life. I want to be clear that I did not misremember this. I knew exactly which conversations I meant, what we discussed, even small details, like the fact that he'd mentioned a knee surgery he was recovering from during our second conversation. I brought up the knee surgery specifically, thinking it would jog something. He went very quiet and asked me how I knew about that. He said he'd had that surgery, yes, but that he had absolutely never discussed it with me, had never had a conversation with me at all as far as he could recall, and that, in fact, he didn't recognize me even slightly. I stood on his porch feeling something shift uncomfortably in my chest. I asked if perhaps he'd simply forgotten. People forget casual conversations all the time. He said this wasn't forgetting. He said he remembered everyone who came up that road, because almost nobody ever did. And he was certain, completely certain, that I had never once stood on his property before that exact moment. He helped me with my truck anyway, towed it back with his own vehicle, and we didn't discuss the strangeness of it further that day. I told myself there had to be an explanation, some mix-up. Maybe I'd actually spoken to someone else entirely and misattributed those conversations to Walt in my memory. About 3 weeks later, I ran into him again at the general store in the small town we both drove into for supplies. He greeted me warmly by name and asked how the truck repair had held up. He referenced our earlier conversation on his porch as though it had happened normally. No confusion at all this time. I asked him, carefully, if he remembered the 2 conversations from before, the ones he'd said never happened. He looked at me with genuine confusion and said of course he remembered them. He remembered everything about living out there. Why was I asking something so strange? I didn't push it further in the moment, but I drove home turning the entire exchange over in my head. The specific quality of his confusion both times. Completely sincere both times. And somehow both times pointing towards something I had absolutely no way to reconcile. Either he had genuinely forgotten meeting me on 3 separate occasions, and then genuinely remembered all of them again 3 weeks later with no memory of having forgotten, or something else had happened on that porch that I still don't have language for. A few months after that, I mentioned the whole strange sequence of events to another acquaintance in town, someone who'd lived in that area much longer than either of us. She went quiet for a moment, then asked, very carefully, what time of day my second conversation with Walt had actually taken place. I told her late afternoon, just before sunset. She said that area, that specific stretch of road between our properties, had a long-standing reputation among old-timers for something locals only ever referred to obliquely, never directly. Something about people experiencing conversations and encounters along that stretch that the other person involved had no memory of, always around that same time of day, always near sunset. She didn't elaborate further, and I didn't ask her to. I still live on that property. Walt and I are friendly enough now. Our conversations consistent and remembered by both of us as far as I can tell. But I avoid that stretch of road near sunset whenever I can help it, and I've never been able to fully explain to myself or to anyone else what actually happened on that porch the first time he told me he'd never met me before. I want to start by saying I am not someone who panics easily. I'd lived off-grid for almost 6 years at the point this happened, on a piece of land along a river valley in the Pacific Northwest that I'd chosen specifically for its remoteness and the natural beauty of the water below the property. I knew that river. I'd watched its seasonal changes for years. I understood, or thought I understood, every risk that came with living that close to it. What happened took every bit of that understanding and made it useless in the span of about 4 minutes. It was early spring, a season I was familiar with, snowmelt season, when the river typically ran higher than usual, but in a way I'd watched happen reliably every year without serious incident. I'd gone to bed that night after checking the water level the way I always did, a habit so routine I barely thought about it consciously anymore. The level was elevated, but completely within the range I'd seen plenty of times before. I woke up to a sound I had never heard in 6 years of living there. Not rushing water, which I was used to. Something deeper. A kind of low, continuous groan that seemed to come from the ground itself rather than the river, vibrating up through the cabin's foundation in a way that made the windows rattle slightly in their frames. I got up immediately and went outside with a flashlight, and what I saw stopped me completely for a few seconds. I genuinely could not afford to lose. The river had risen at least 6 feet since I'd checked it before bed, and it was still climbing visibly while I stood there watching the water line creeping up the bank in real time in a way that defied every seasonal pattern I'd ever witnessed. Whole sections of bank were collapsing into the current as I watched, trees along the edge tilting and then disappearing beneath the surface within seconds of each other. I understood, with a clarity that cut through every bit of disbelief, that the water was going to reach my cabin, and soon. I went back inside and grabbed exactly what I could carry without slowing myself down. Wallet, keys, the small fireproof box with my important documents, my phone, even though I knew it wouldn't have signal, and nothing else. I did not stop to think about anything I was leaving behind. I made it back outside in under 90 seconds. The water had already reached the base of my front steps. My truck was parked about 40 yards from the cabin, uphill, and I covered that distance faster than I think I have ever moved in my life, sloshing through water that hadn't existed in that spot 5 minutes earlier, now ankle-deep and rising with a current strong enough that I genuinely worried about losing my footing. I got the truck started and pulled it further up the access road, then turned around just long enough to watch the actual moment my cabin's foundation gave way. It happened almost gently, considering the violence of everything around it, a kind of slow tilt before the entire structure was swallowed by water that, less than 10 minutes earlier, had been a normal, manageable spring river running its expected course. I drove to the nearest neighbor with a working phone and called for help. And over the following days, as the water receded, I learned something that has never sat right with me, something I still cannot fully explain. There had been no unusual snowmelt that week, no storm upstream. The Weather Service had no record of any rainfall event significant enough to account for that kind of rise. I spoke with a hydrologist eventually, someone the county brought in to assess the damage along that stretch of river, and he told me with visible discomfort that based on every available data point, that river should not have risen the way I described it rising. Certainly not within the time frame I described. He asked me several times if I was certain about the speed of it, the 6 feet, the 4 minutes. I told him I was certain because I had been standing there watching it happen. Certain because I'd had to outrun it myself with nothing but what I could carry in my arms. He didn't have an explanation. The county's official report listed the event as an unexplained flash flood, a designation that, as far as I understand it, is rarely used for a river with no storm activity and no unusual snowmelt to account for it. I rebuilt further up the valley, higher ground this time, further from the water than I'd ever have considered necessary before. I still check the river level every single night before bed, a habit that has only gotten more obsessive rather than less, even though I know, logically, that whatever happened that night had nothing to do with the kind of seasonal patterns any amount of checking could have predicted. I think about those 4 minutes more than almost anything else in my life, about how close I came to still being inside when the foundation gave way, about a river that, according to every expert who examined it afterward, should never have done what I watched it do. I don't have an answer for what caused it. I just know I got out in time, and I know exactly how little margin there was between getting out and not getting out at all.